Welcome back to Inside the Pastor's Study podcast. I'm Pastor Jeremy.
And I'm Pastor George.
We are a father and son pastoral team. We're serving in a small town north of Boston, Massachusetts, in a small church. And we come here hopefully every week. The goal is always on Monday to give you a picture into the things that pastors tend to talk about throughout the week in their study. So that's you're getting that little window into what happens in the church office on a week-to-week basis. Those conversations that we sit around with and wonder about and think through. A lot of times these are church-related. It is our heartbeat. It is what we think about for a large portion of our day. Sometimes it's just like life-related too. That happens a lot. But we do our best to use this podcast as a way to think through some issues and some ideas that don't necessarily have their space in like a normal church forum. It's hard to stand up in a pulpit and talk about some of these things because it just doesn't fit the format. So this is like a chance for you to think through, get inside our brains and pick around and hear what we think about certain things and hear what pastors tend to talk about and how they talk as you get through the week. So we're glad you're here. I was just thinking about this. I was referring to our town, Methuen, as a small town, but it's actually massive.
It's a small city, yeah.
Yeah, if you're anywhere outside of the Northeast, it would be, it'd be a bigger dot on the map. But yeah, for, Northeast, it's all relative, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, we're here. So, which is like an inverse thing now that I'm thinking about it with church size, right? Like, so if you move out of the Northeast to church size, we're a small church.
Yes, but
in the Northeast, we're like a medium-sized.
Yeah.
It's all. I guess it's all relative. But here we are. We're here. We're excited to be back on a Monday.
I wonder if anybody's done the math on that.
There's got to be some kind of graph.
Yeah.
If you are a graph-related person, we'll put that in your hands. You can drop it on our Facebook page for other people to see. The Facebook page, honestly, has not gotten a lot of traction. We have a number of listeners. No one uses the Facebook page. I guess it's a chance for you to just see the announcement that a new post is up. But you could, if you're listening to this, be one of those brave people to begin a conversation on there. Ask the question, let others interact with it. Because my guess is a lot of people see the things that go on there, but don't necessarily interact. Here's your chance. After today's episode and after you've gone and shared it with a friend and gone and hit like or rated or reviewed us in whatever podcast app you listen to, you can also go to our Facebook page, Inside the Pastor's Study Podcast, pose a question on there on something that you heard in today's podcast. So there you go. You have the preview now. I'm warning you in ahead of time. If we hit something in our conversation today that makes you ask a question, that's a good place to put it. And in all honesty, I know where we're going today in our podcast, and you're probably going to have questions, and it is okay to ask those when we get there. So I'm primed. You're primed now. You're ready to go. So we want to begin our podcast. We do this with frequency. We want to begin with another theological term of the week.
The theological term of the week.
And this week, our term is
power.
Power. And it's just a normal term. I feel like we're into this space. We're pulling our first theological words out of an ancient catechism, the Westminster Seminary, no, just the Westminster Catechism.
Yeah.
The first question is, who is God? The answer has all of these attributes, these 10 attributes of God, and we've been working through all of those in this to begin this theological term conversation. And we're into the words now that don't feel like theological terms to me. They just feel like normal words we use in our conversation. So these are, which is different, because I think sometimes we talk about theological terms and they are way outside of our normal word usage, and it's confusing. But this also can be confusing because they're words that are in our normal lexicon, but they're used theologically, and so they have a different twist.
They have depth. That's the issue, is that they have depth. Because here's the thing, we're talking about, really, those of you who have been listening know that we're talking about mutable aspects or attributes of God. And mutable attributes are attributes that you and I, every single human being, saved or unsaved, actually has that in their life because they are in the image of God. So everyone has an element of wisdom, That element of wisdom. The first time you touch the hot stove, you learn, and from that point on, you've gained wisdom, and you don't touch the hot stove again.
You hopefully apply the knowledge you have, right?
Exactly, right? So same thing with power. In many ways, all of us as human beings understand that we are powerful. We have authority. Actually, that's one of those cool things about that mutability concept is God even expresses his concept of authority or power to us because he puts us in this world with an authoritative charge to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over it. So there's this power that just naturally flows from God to humanity because we have this authority from him to actually serve in this world.
Right. So this is like, would you also use like the word agency here? Like you have the capability of doing things? Is that the sense of power we're talking about?
Sure. It's not just agency. There is the agency, but there's also the ability. So you've got both of the A's in there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But we're talking about God. We're not talking about us.
Right. Yeah. But sometimes going through how we can express it gives us a better picture on how God is perfect in it.
Right. Exactly. And there's a multiplier there, right? Because when God doesn't have someone who has given him authority, his authority, he already has the authority. And you see that even in Jesus, who says that all authority is given to him through God the Father to accomplish great tasks, to accomplish the task of salvation in the world.
Yeah.
So that's why we have been imputed with that authority from God to go into all of the world and make disciples, baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Right.
So there's authority flowing from God the
flow
Father.
Of authority through
to
God.
Jesus.
Yeah. To us. And our authority is based on his power, which is in us because of the Holy Spirit.
And because of our creation, because of our image.
Combination of both of those things.
Exactly.
That's why we get to move mountains and things.
Yes. Yeah. So here's an interesting aspect of God's power. So God, I've often come across that old atheist wag who just throws out the term of, well, if God is all powerful, can he make a rock too heavy for himself to lift? Which would then be, of course, a limit on his power. And there's some desire to somehow limit God's power and say that he's not, big term that fits into this term is omnipotent.
Or all powerful.
All powerful, right? So if God is omnipotent, then can God do something that's outside of his power because he has the power to do it?
Right. So can we use human Greek logic to encapsulate who God is?
Yeah, and the answer to that obviously is no, because God is powerful. He's omnipotent, but his power is actually channeled through all of the other attributes and aspects of who he is. So, infinite power. His power will never run out. It's eternal. It's wise. Right. So that means that God uses his power according to his understanding and knowledge, which is limitless. We talked about that last time we were together. His power is benevolent. It's good. It's going to be used for good all the time and in all ways. We probably will come up to that in just a few minutes. So God's power is channeled. It's not just.
So you can't isolate all of these attributes of God. They have to be viewed in concert.
Always.
Yeah. So you can't just say God is only all powerful.
Right.
God is also all wise.
Right.
And because we talked about wisdom last week, so his abundance of wisdom, his perfection in wisdom would inform his application of power and authority.
Right, exactly. So to put this into perspective, take two forms of power. Let's take nuclear power. So if I put if I encase a nuclear reaction surround a heart of plutonium surrounded by smaller hearts of uranium, all focusing their neurons in on that plutonium, and I just put it in a case and I drop it on a city, I release that power in an uncontrolled environment where it just accomplishes what it will, which is the obliteration of everything in the city.
Right.
right?
But if you can drop that into the engine of a DeLorean, you can go back in time.
Yes, exactly. As long as you can get up to
88 miles an hour,
which
is
you're
tricky
fine.
in a DeLorean.
Yes. Yeah. See, you didn't get that in the movie originally.
Yeah.
88 was just not going to happen.
Not quickly.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, right. So you have unconstrained power, and then you have constrained power. And God is God self-constraining? Is that kind of
That's
the idea?
the thing. God is self-constrained. He's self-containing and constraining. He's going to use his power in a way that is fitting and in keeping with his character, his glory, and his attributes. So he's always going to be flowing that power out in the right direction and in the right way. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I think of when I think of God's power, which maybe we don't always think about it, is that God is creative. I mean, if you were looking through this list of attributes that we've talked about a couple of times, you come to this idea of well, okay, so I've got God as infinite, eternal, unchangeable, and his being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. Where do I come up with a God who can create the earth, have the power to create the heaven and the earth and all that is in it in 7 24-hour days? Mm-hmm. Where do I come up with a God who can divide a Red Sea and bring 2.5 million people through it, and then as their enemies are starting to chase them through that, make the dry land become soggy and then squash them all in with water? Where do I come up with a creative God who is like that? Because those are creative aspects of God.
Right. They're creative uses of his power, but they're also demonstrations of his incredible power and authority, because they're beyond the scope of human imagination.
Exactly. Which, 2 words, right? Because I say God has power, and because I say that God is infinite and eternal in his power, I also embrace the reality that God is powerful in his imagination, and he is capable of thinking up amazing things that he is capable of doing. And I say that God is creative in his power, because what he uses his power for is always good, because that's part of his character too, but it's beautiful when it comes out, when it comes to its final expression. It's a beautiful thing. Mm-hmm. So when I'm talking about God's power, I'm talking about God being creative, and I'm talking about God being imaginative, and God being capable of doing things that we just would never even think of, because we're humans and we're finite.
Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful thing to think about. Yeah, just maybe this is a chance for you, as you're listening, to pause this for a second, pause us, and just meditate on this idea for a moment and come back. But to think, if I had the power to imagine, what is one of the grandest things that I can imagine in my own life, and then if I had the power to exercise that, what would it look like? And then where is the wisdom in that, and where's the goodness in that? Like, to just kind of ponder on that and meditate on that, and then apply that and think that through the lens of who our creative God is, that he has all of that ability, that he can be an imaginative God who comes up with wonderful things that are good, and that are, we'll talk about goodness, and we're getting ahead on that one, but that are good, but then are exercised in wisdom, and then he can actually make it happen when he wants to make it happen, because his timing is perfect and all of that. So it's a really an amazing thing to consider.
Let's throw an additional wrinkle on that. Let's make an application point in that, because we've said God is all powerful, but we've also said that God has muted that type of power to us. And I think that one of the things that we as Christians need to grasp is that every time we as human beings express creativity and imagination, we're following in the pattern of our powerful God. We have the power to create. I mean, I look at a Thomas Edison who is creative and imaginative in taking things that didn't work and making them work. I think of a Elon Musk, a current day guy who has done some amazing things. I mean, he's just out on the edge. He's out on the border, just doing some creative stuff and being super, super imaginative. And I doubt very strongly that Elon Musk is a believer, but the power to create, the power to imagine, those are things that come from God. Mm-hmm. And I think that the just perspective on our culture and on our day, I think that we are losing our creativity and our imagination because we've limited God's power in our own lives. Mm-hmm. And I think Christians should be the most creative people out there.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I think that...
Well, when you get to combine the indwelling of the Holy Spirit into your action, then there is an extra sense of power and agency in your life. Right?
Yeah.
That the rest of the world doesn't have.
Yeah.
We all have this shared attribute of creativity and power, but as a Christian, we also have the Holy Spirit, which should increase the flow of that power into the places that we put our energy. And I think the concern for Christians, right? I think that exists. But my concern for Christians is we're so busy applying all of that power to fitting in with the rest of the world and we're doing such a great job at it because Christians are great at the things that they do, that we end up being just as bland as the rest of our culture is.
Right. There's no, hey, think of it this way. Miracles are daring.
Yeah.
Well, human beings should be daring. Christians should be daring in their creativity. Yep. And I think that that's part of the power of God in our lives, to stand back and say, we can't do that. Or to stand back and just say, I'm not even going to think about that, is outside of the realm of Christian thought.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's the Philippians concept that we should be training our mind to think on the things that are true, noble, excellent, praiseworthy, those things. And there are things that we just say that this is not worth my time, and we move on from it. I remember one of the Sherlock Holmes things, right? Like there are things that he just like eliminates from his brain
from
because
the citadel of the mind.
From the citadel of the mind, because it's just not worth the hard drive space, so to speak, for him. And I loved that. I love that analogy because I'm good at, there are things that I'm just good at intentionally forgetting because they're not worth me remembering. But there are these other random trivial facts that just stick in there forever because I found them interesting. There's, I think, a way that we can also express our power that's given to us through our God is to be able to say, like, my mind needs to be trained on certain things that are useful.
Yes.
And I also have the power to ignore these other things that are useless. And the way we apply the muted wisdom to us is to be able to discern the difference between the two.
Right. And then
act on it.
Act on it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Good word.
Power. You have it. It's from your God.
Yes. Who's all powerful.
Yep. And exercises it in perfect wisdom and justice and truth and all of the other words. So, in the American way, wisdom, is that what I went through?
Maybe, yeah.
Probably not that.
No.
I think it's a little bit bigger than that. Anyway, so there is. There's our term of the week.
The theological term of the week.
So, we've been working through the book of Joshua in our sermon series. I think we've now come to an end. Is that true?
We have one more sermon.
Is there one more?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have in our church. In our church, we have a missionary family coming in, which I'm excited about this weekend. That changed a bit of our flow of the sermon series, and we're really close now to Advent, which I love. Like, I've already started playing some Christmas music in the house. Yeah, it's that time, man. I love this stuff. I have neighbors who were putting up lights last weekend, and I wasn't mad at that at all. It was a nice day. It makes sense. So, before you get mad, I'm not all the way there yet, friends. Like, I like to phase in my holiday spirit here, but it's time. I'm good with this. Anyway, so
I just see Thanksgiving as the beginning of a month of
it's part of the season.
Yes.
Yeah. Like, we should be thankful in this season of
Yes.
joy, right? It's
Right.
good to like start off the season with this remembrance of gratitude, but we can build, it's all one thing for
It
me.
is.
It's one holiday that you
Yep.
get to just, Anyway, you can, send your complaints to office@marchcorner.com and I'll ignore them. So the series that we've been talking about in Joshua, there is this elephant in the room that we've been not quite addressing.
Yeah,
Like we
sort of.
hint at the elephant. We talk about it occasionally in our sermons. But the elephant is this: how can we as Christians, who I'm going to paint us as a people with the broad brush of culture that we have been painted with. So if Christians are supposed to be loving, and if Christians are supposed to hate violence, then how can we possibly justify the actions of Israel that were instructed to them by God in the book of Joshua, where they would go through and act in like a genocidal way? How could they possibly, without regard to a person's actions, just entirely devastate a whole culture, men, women, and children? I mean, the Bible, God Himself is advocating for the murder of children in the book of Joshua.
Yeah.
And how can a Christian read that and talk about that God, but also talk about this love and this this redemption story that you have in Jesus? Like, those two things don't seem to mesh up well. So how do we talk about war? And this is hard even fast forwarding through, even in American culture. You have Christians who have stood at the very front lines of battle in war, whether it be in any of the major wars in the United States. You have Christians who have helped lead those wars. You have people who have proclaimed their allegiance to Jesus, who would plot out destruction for their country and act on destruction for their country and pull the trigger of destruction for their country. When you have other Christians who would abstain from all of that because of the same book that they're reading.
Right.
And so this idea of war is difficult. And so now that the elephant is exposed,
Right.
where do we go and how do we talk about war and the involvement of believers in it?
So I think we have to put a couple of pieces together from the broad picture, right? So the first piece in this, I think, is the Romans 13 passage, the Romans 13 structure, which tells me that there is a responsibility for civil government to wield the sword of justice. So there is a responsibility for governments, that's organizations of human beings gathered together under a similar civil existence, not just for taxation. I mean, we use that Romans 13 passage to justify being taxed. We use it to, I heard folks using it as a justification for shutting down churches for COVID, which I think is crazy. Don't think we really belonged there. But it's clear from Romans 13 that Paul says that the civil government has two responsibilities of justice. They have the responsibility for wielding the sword over their own citizenry and holding them accountable for right and wrong. So that incorporates the concept of capital punishment. But they also hold the sword over the world to hold other nations and peoples accountable for justice. Justice is a term that comes from God. It's not a term that comes from human beings. We're not going to invade a country because they're putting too many hydrocarbons into the air. Although who knows these days the way things are being perverted. There's a concept of justice, a concept of right and wrong that is from God. And God holds men accountable for their justice. So there is a concept where the civil government has the responsibility for war. I guess the question that really comes into play is, when is a war a right thing? When is it a wrong thing? At what point There's three, and my second thought here is that there really are three types of war. Right? There's an aggressive war where a nation or a group of people are trying to take over or take resources, land, and people away from another nation. So that would be an aggression and an aggressive war. And I don't think that the Bible actually points out a picture where an aggressive war is actually the right place. There's a defensive war where being approached by an aggressor, you protect yourself, right? And then there's this third concept, which I call the concept of the just war. And the just war is where a nation acting on God's behalf is meting out justice to another nation that has violated God's terms and God's principles. Now, here's how God has done this in the past. The first thing that you see is that God sees in Genesis chapter 6 that all of the world is corrupt. And there's this string in Genesis 6 that all of the people all of the time were thinking of doing evil in everything that they do always.
Yeah.
Like there is just this
There's nothing redeeming about the culture.
Not a thing redeeming about the culture. So in this irredeemable culture, God pulls 8 people out of the picture and says, I'm just going to destroy the whole thing. So what is God doing? He's acting justly in his destruction of all of humanity, men, women, children, animals, birds, everything, even plant life, it all dies.
Yeah.
It all dies. And what God says is this is my statement of justice. He says, but interestingly enough, he's going to express that justice again in the book of Revelation. But between Genesis and the flood and Revelation with the destruction of the heaven and the earth, there is this meting out of justice.
Just as like a huge rabbit trail, I'm wondering if people tie their view of whether the flood was local or universal to this concept of God's doling out of justice on an entire culture. Or not.
That'd be right. Yeah.
If you are a person who struggles with God's application of justice, do you also consider the flood to be more local than, or I feel like a lot of times we don't take a certain theological stance and work out how it applies to the whole story, but it is a unified story.
It is.
And so when you make certain statements about certain things, it does have an application to other things. And so if God is going to act universally against culture to destroy it and only saves out one righteous man and his children, then that has a statement about justice that is different, I think, than if God were to only destroy a certain culture and leave other cultures that are not mentioned in Scripture alone or other places alone. It's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so apply that again, right? God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah. He takes one righteous man
and his 2 kids and his struggling wife. He takes them out of that culture so that he can destroy it. Yeah.
Because its wickedness had risen up before God, and he could not stomach their sin anymore. Which is super powerful when you consider this concept of Joshua coming in and destroying the men, women, and children of all of the Canaanites who are in this area. Because God says to that Abraham, who is the uncle of that man Lot, in the very same time frame and just contemporaneously,
right?
He says to him, Genesis 15, he says, Abraham, here's your life. I'm going to make your children like the sand of the seashore and the stars of the sky. I'm going to gather you to be with me. You will be with your fathers, and your children, your generations, he says, will go to a land that is not their own, where they will be persecuted but they will grow and come out of that land after 400 years. And I will give them this land that you are in now. And here's this crazy statement. Because the fullness of the wickedness of the Canaanites is not yet here.
Mm-hmm. I go back and forth on this. Like, God is essentially like turning like the test knob on his fishing line, right? Like, or whatever. Like, he's letting them run with their wickedness,
right,
to exhaust themselves,
right,
and then he's going to judge them at the end of that period of time. And he knows how long that fish is going to run, and he knows, because of his perfect wisdom and his perfect, all of these things we talk about in our theological terms. He knows how long that fish is going to run, and he knows exactly when he's going to start reeling it in, and then end it.
I consider the deferred penalty concept in hockey.
Yeah,
we're in the New England, so we have
right. Like the ref has thrown his hand up.
He says, "There's a foul here. I'm going to call a penalty, right? But I'm going to give the other team has the puck right now, and I'm going to give them opportunity to score with it.
Right.
If they don't score, I'm calling this penalty."
Yeah. So in a sense, like God's saying, like, even already, Canaan has currently deserved the evil end that I have prescribed for it. It's coming in 400 years where it will be even worse.
Yes.
But they've already earned this destruction.
Absolutely.
And Abraham, through your descendants, I'm going to enact my justice.
Right. So it's not a war of aggression. Joshua entering the land and Israel entering the land is not a war of aggression.
It's often pitched that way by people who have a different perspective on the Old Testament.
We even use Judaism. The word conquest.
Yeah. Right, conquest of the land. We use it all the time.
It's not a conquest.
Yeah.
It's not a conquest. It's the land belonged to them by God's direction way back in Genesis 12. So 450 years earlier, God had already said to Abraham, "This is your land. Oh, there's a group of people who are living in it, but don't worry, they're wicked. Mm-hmm. I'm going to get them out of here." Mm-hmm. And then 450 years later, Israel is on the brink of taking what is going to be their land. And it's not that they're taking the land. It's that they're exercising judgment on God's behalf on a very, very wicked group of people who God has said, this is justice. These people are so wicked. These people are so despicable. This is justice that you invade and that you destroy this people completely because they are so vastly wicked, and their wickedness will infect anybody who's around them.
Yeah, which is the rest of the Old Testament story, that it continues to infect. So I was thinking about this earlier when we were talking about the aggressive style of war, and I guess it's still, I was wondering if, like, David's conquests, where his kingdom expands to its largest, probably Israel's largest borders, right under David and Solomon, are those wars of aggression or wars of justice? Because there are people who are left over from the time of Joshua who are never quite dealt with.
That's a big issue. Yep.
Right, and so are those wars aggressive, or are they? And I wonder that now as we have this conversation, and the answer is probably both, right? Because you read those books, you read the Samuels and the Chronicles, and you see that sometimes even the good kings are acting out of selfishness and foolishness. And so it's possible that some of those expansion efforts are aggressive and probably not condoned by the Lord, where other expansion efforts are still acts of judgment against the people who are remaining, who have needed that judgment still, and who have never faced it.
So let's put a couple of conflict issues in perspective in David's life. Most of David is the conqueror of the Philistines. So mm-hmm. David drives the Philistines out of Israel's purview. For the most part, there are still some Philistine, places in Gaza, in Dan, in mm-hmm. that area. But then again, Dan has already abdicated their land, and they've moved way out of the picture. So you have that. There are three major conflicts in David's life, or three major nations in which that David could have had conflict with. The first is Lebanon, and Lebanon actually is under a man named Hiram, and Hiram says to David, "Hey, you're a powerful king. I'm not going to fight you. Let's have a peace treaty." So David and the Phoenicians are fine with one another. There's no issue there. The other two countries are Ammon and Moab. And I see it as this way, that Ammon and Moab are also where you're going to find the people called the Midianites, who are the people in Gideon's day who come sweeping on a regular basis into Israel and plundering it.
Is this Midianites like Moses' father-in-law Midianites?
Well, so...
Or is that a region?
Jethro, yeah. So he was from the region of Midian. So it's kind of like calling my cousin Italian.
Okay.
Right.
But you're not fighting against him in World War II.
Fighting against them. Yeah, it's different. So Jethro really was a Midianite because that's where he was from, but it wasn't necessarily his nation, his tribe. So I see it this way. I think that Moab and Ammon on a regular basis are making incursions into Israel. And in making incursions into Israel, you get an element of defensive war, drive them back. And in the process of driving them back, you drive them to a place where they are no longer going to attack you.
Right. If you can sack the quarterback deep, then he has to punt.
Good term. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. So I left one country out, Edom.
Yeah.
And the Edomites show up late in David, not really much in Solomon, but then they become an issue in the divided kingdom. But all those countries, Moab, of course, attacking in the days of Jehoshaphat, all of those are situations where there's just no love lost between the Moabites, Ammonites, and Israel, which of course is interesting because they're cousins.
Yeah.
So unlike the Canaanites, the Moabites and the Ammonites are actually related to Israel.
Right, because you have the tribe out of Esau, and you have the tribe out of...
the two tribes out of Lot, Moab and Ammon.
Right. Yep.
So there's just conflict there, and the conflict comes... I don't think Israel is spoiling for war in those things. I think it's a situation where they are attacked, and then they attack back.
Okay.
And they take land.
Yeah.
Or they put the king under authority, and he has to pay
some sort of tribute.
Right? It's actually the other way around. For example, the Edomites at one point sacked Jerusalem in the days of Rehoboam, and they're held accountable for that even later on. One of the things that Obadiah holds them accountable for is that they cut open the pregnant women.
Right, yeah.
In their assault.
Such a horrendous word picture.
Yeah.
Which is not just a picture.
But reality of war.
Yeah.
And they were savage, and yeah. So you don't see that savagery in Israel's war of justification. They're killing everybody. But they're killing everybody in a righteous objective.
Yeah.
So there's applications to that, like World War II, for example. There are many who see the incursions of Adolf Hitler in Europe and say, well, he's been an aggressor. But not only has he been an aggressor, he's been an aggressor where he's oppressing people in other nations, and contrary to what is coming out in a lot of culture these days, and as awful as the Holocaust was not news in the United States.
Yeah, we didn't know about it.
It was there. The
average American citizen did not know about the Holocaust.
Right. So like in 1941, the New York Times ran an article on the Holocaust, on the concentration camps and possibly even the death camps for Jews. But the New York Times ran that on the back page of the C section of the newspaper in a small one-column article that most people actually didn't even get to. So the average American actually had no idea of the Holocaust. It was downplayed by the media in the United States because that was just a very anti-Semitic perspective in the United States at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So even though the New York Times was run and owned by a Jewish family, they didn't think it was an article worth running. So that aspect of the just war didn't really even come into play at the time, but there's other aspects, the oppression, it wasn't just Jews that the German army was murdering. Right. You get into the the Pacific War and the assault on China. That
it's horrendous.
And most Americans don't even know about that today.
I've done a lot of study on that in the last year. There's the rise and fall of the Japanese Empire, and the stories of what the Japanese Empire did to its neighboring countries pre-World War II is some of the most atrocious and disgusting acts of aggression that I've ever even seen.
Yeah.
Just awful stuff.
Yeah,
happening.
Absolutely. And so there's an element of just war going into that.
Yeah.
Now,
I feel like World War II is one of our easier ones.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's harder, for example, to, the Korean conflict in the 1950s is it's an aggressor issue.
Yeah, I think, isn't that an action against Chinese communism? Is that what's going on there?
Yeah, North Korea, the Chinese eventually flow into that as well, but only after MacArthur has pushed the North Korean army basically to the Chinese border.
Mm-hmm.
But there's still an aggression. There's still the North Koreans funded by the Chinese and mostly by the Russians, interestingly enough, push down into South Korea to take control of it. And, then because it's an aggression, the aggression's pushed back. Vietnam, questionable, because again, you do have an aggression by, most people don't realize this, but the North Vietnamese are actually a different tribal culture than the South Vietnamese. So as much as you want to say it's one nation, it's actually two tribes living in the same nation or the same geography, and it created some issues. And but again, an aggression.
Right. And that gets tricky because some of that aggression is tied into Vietnam is tough. That's a hard one to wrestle with, because you have that aggression piece. You also have the European colonizer being booted out in the process of that, and so they're an ally. You have some of those conversations in there,
and you also
that we're trying to stand up for that maybe isn't necessarily the right team to back, but there are still bad teams in this conversation. This is like the complicated fabric of world policy, of foreign policy. But I think this is one of the things that helps for me in this conversation about just war. This is as an individual, I can act in certain ways that I believe are righteous and just toward other individuals. But as nations, you can try and make these larger actions that maybe free some of the individuals who are operating on behalf of their nation from some responsibility in that decision-making process.
Yeah.
Because I don't know all the picture, but as a nation, we've said, this is right, this is wrong, based on our sense of justice and our belief in justice. And it's my responsibility to just choose to follow that or not.
Right. And here's another thing, right? What the nation decides to do is not individual responsibility. I mean, if you are in the military and you have been called upon to be in an infantry unit where you are going to shed blood, that's the nation's work that you're doing. It's not you. I realize that this comes home with a lot of guys with PTSD, especially for, as Christians, you're struggling with, I've taken a life.
Mm-hmm.
No, your nation has taken a life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you need to thread this needle here. Sure, you pulled the trigger, but you pulled the trigger on behalf of your nation, and your nation is the one who's going to stand or fall before God for that.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an element of justice, that capital punishment, kind
Similar
of in the
thing, right?
same
Because
right.
we don't necessarily. I've never actually seen the interview of a person who's been a button presser on the
electric chair,
electric chair, or for the lethal injection or anything. It'd be an interesting thing, but our conversation around capital punishment tends to be more: is this the right action of the state or the wrong action of the state? Which I think is the right conversation.
Yes, absolutely.
Because it is a state action; it's not an individual action.
Right. No one. The old story is that they used to have 13 men in a firing squad, and only 12 guns were loaded, so that one guy could actually say that I didn't fire the round.
Yeah,
they killed him.
Right. Yeah, and they wouldn't know who it is, so nobody knew whether it was their round or not. Therefore, it was an action done by the state in that circumstance, not by the individuals who are holding the weapon.
And that's the same thing with war. Is that if you go to war and you've gone to war because your nation has said this is a just war, we have a righteous argument here. We're defending against an aggressor. We're standing for righteousness from a biblical and moral worldview.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's no issue there. It's when I become an aggressor.
And I guess I think that's what it comes down for the individual Christian. Whatever country you're in, as you're listening to this podcast, I think it's the responsibility of the believer when they are engaged with the conflict that their nation has gone toward to say, is my nation acting in a sense of biblical justice? Are they acting from a place of self-defense, or are they acting aggressively? And then to make the decision from there, do I abstain from this action or not? I mean, there are great stories of German believers who went through that thought process and decided, no, this is not righteous. I will not participate. And didn't, famously so. Like you have guys like Dietrich Bonhoeffer who would not act. But you have other German believers who do participate in the war for their nation. And this is where, again, it gets interesting, because their belief is that something was taken from them and they're going back to reclaim it. Or they're just acting on behalf of their state, and they're not making these decisions. It's their state. This gets really hard.
Yeah. I've been researching a lot on World War I in the last several years. Just 100th anniversary, we don't talk about World War I a lot because the United States actually wasn't involved.
Yeah.
I mean, we were actually and people are saying, well,
it was nearly finished and we came and mopped up.
It was nearly finished, and we just actually pushed the thing to its end. That's what we did. But all of the nations that got into World War I got in through basically conflicting alliances, and everybody thought they were threatened.
Yeah.
Everybody thought that they were threatened and that they were just. The Germans, the Austrians, who were the Axis powers, the Germans and the Austrians, and I'm assuming the Ottomans, they all believed that they were oppressed,
mm-hmm.
and that they were acting out because they were being threatened by another nation. And of course, when they would act out because they were being threatened, they were seen as aggressors by other nations, and the only people who really had any issue here were the Serbians. The Serbians were the aggressors.
Yeah.
And they ceased to exist during the war. So, you can't take it out on them, so you take it out on the losers.
This is, I think this is where this conversation gets really difficult. I can understand from reading scripture just war and unjust war. I can understand God working through the people of Israel and being exceptionally patient. That's one of the things that stands out so much about the campaign in under Joshua, is that this was a 400-year delayed act of justice. That really, in a sense, you're giving people ample time to earn their
Reward.
to earn the to earn the result of their actions, right? But like in current foreign policy, it gets really difficult because
Absolutely.
I do see things through an American lens. I see things through a conservative American lens. So I see things through, my brother, your son serves in the military. Your dad served in World War II with distinction. Like we have these family stories that we can tell, and we value that, and we value that sort of service. And I adore my country, and I understand, but it gets difficult here as a Christian, because I also see in my current country as one that's not entirely interested in serving God first.
Yes, that's a conflict.
And so when it comes to modern day acts of aggression or defense or justice, it gets difficult.
Right. Are we actually acting in justice, or is it some contrived understanding of justice?
Yeah.
As I said, we see countries that put too many hydrocarbons into the air as unjust these days. Where, and this is a tough term. We have left morality and virtue up to the culture. So therefore, suddenly, what's moral and right is in flux.
Right. So look
There's no authority, no power to what is moral.
Right. We've left Afghanistan.
Right.
And we've left it to a group that for 20 years we've said are evil and aggressive.
And they still are.
And they still, I would say, to a biblical lens, are acting out of their evil and out of their aggression. And I see stories coming out still. We've forgotten about it because it's not in the news anymore. But the stories I'm seeing out of Afghanistan right now are exactly what most of us expected to see at this turnover. But I feel like our nation has said, well, this is just how that tribe works. This is a tribal country, and they should be able to exercise in their tribal way. Like, well, yeah, but their tribal actions are biblically evil.
Yeah. Yeah.
And whose responsibility is it to enact justice there?
That's interesting. Let me give you an interesting. I follow a historian named Victor Davis Hanson. He's actually not a historian. He's something called a classicist, which is just an amazing field of study. He's one of these guys that has read not just Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, but just about every major Greek document and Roman document. He understands classics.
Okay.
And Hanson has a series on YouTube, I believe, on World War II. And one of the things that he says is that World War II really begins for the United States as a series of border wars that the United States has no interest in getting involved in.
Right. That's why we wait until we're attacked.
Right.
In a sense, right?
Right.
Like, we'll support our allies financially, but we're not going to.
Right. So, I mean, what drags us into World War II is when we are actually assaulted at Pearl Harbor, and he points out, and it should be the only nation that Adolf Hitler actually ever declared war on was the United States. He didn't declare war on Russia. He didn't declare war on France or on England. He declares war on the United States. And he had to, because at that point he needed to uphold his treaty with the Japanese. But he also needed to keep us, in a sense, he needed to put us on notice that he was going to fight us. But Hansen noted that, when Hitler takes over Poland, as atrocious as it is, it's not our fight.
Right.
When Hitler takes over Austria, it's not our fight. Even when Hitler invades Russia, that's definitely not our fight. So there is this point, I think, where Christians in the United States, and I think that this is highly influential in American culture, we need to be slow to war. Should we have been in Afghanistan?
Great question.
Was it just... I go back 20 years to when we went into... I've been cursed with this memory of my existence, which is really... It's a curse. I remember when we went in to Afghanistan, we went into Afghanistan not to fight the Afghans, but to root out terrorists.
Right.
And somewhere along the line, the mission shifted to fighting Afghanis. Possibly because the Afghanis were supporting the terrorists. I think that it's just for us to be out of there. As wicked and as evil and terrifying as what's going on there. Because maybe the truth of the matter is the time hasn't come. Maybe I would venture to say God will hold the wickedness of Afghanistan accountable. Just like I believe that God will hold the wickedness of other Islamic caliphates accountable. I think, for example, there's some horrifying stuff going on in Yemen that we as Americans don't even know about because most of us can't even find Yemen on the map.
Yeah.
The Iranian situation looks horrifying in its injustice, especially since they have plans for the destruction of friends of our country.
Even the Saudis, who are kind of an ally.
Yeah, exactly. But there's an element of injustice there. There's a lot of aggressiveness going on in China. Interesting. I saw a story this morning about how the Chinese have actually mapped out aircraft carrier silhouettes in the Gobi Desert as a test run for their missiles. And they're not just any aircraft carriers.
They look like United States
aircraft carriers. They look like
carriers?
American aircraft carriers, right? So is there aggression? Is there aggressiveness? Is that something that the United States should be reacting to? And maybe the correct answer is no. Let's wait until God is ready to exercise justice. And I think that when it's the right time to exercise that justice, we'll know it. I think that every nation would know that. Now, here's the other side of this. To exercise justice as God commands requires a just nation.
Right.
And I think one of the things that we as Christians take for granted here is that the United States is a just nation. And we are far more just. Let me put this into perspective. We are far more just than many, many, many nations in the world. I think that we operate on a concept in general that says that, the 70% of the population of the United States that still calls themselves Christians, still operating on the concept of a higher morality, a higher virtue. But I think that if we are going to exercise justice in our world, that we better exercise justice at home. We should be pursuing justice in our own personal lives. And justice in our own personal lives is the concept of meeting the needs of the poor, not having the state. Listen, here's the thing, right? The state exercises justice by killing people. That's the job of the state. The state, the nation, exercises justice by killing people. We as individuals within this nation exercise justice by helping people. And I think that when we grasp the idea as Christians that our nation state is really, really bad at helping people, and that we're really good at it, and we get back to that, we'll get back to a place where the nation state can now start exercising justice the way they're supposed to.
It's an interesting thought. Those two things go together, that the individual's responsibility of justice is to bring life, and the state's responsibility of justice is to bring death. Somebody forgot to mute his phone.
Oh, bummer.
Man. One of those boomer moments, I guess.
Yeah.
So with that bell ringing, it's like it's about that time to wrap up the thought. My guess is that as you've sat through this podcast and listened to this conversation about justice, about war, about the vengeance of the sword from Romans 13, you might be just as confused on this topic as you were when we started. And in all honesty, I'm there too. I wrestle with all of these things as a pastor also. I feel confidence in this idea that it's a state's job to exercise justice in a way that is devastating. My prayer, part of my prayer for my state, is that it would always act in this idea of justice and not out of aggression or self-interest. It's a way that I think that as Christians, we can be praying for our country. Sometimes we talk about praying for our country, and that is this ambiguous term. But one of the ways that we should pray for our country is that it acts out of justice, it acts out of biblical justice. And then I love this challenge of us being a people who act out of righteous justice by bringing life into people who need it. So I hope you're challenged with that. I hope it's giving you something to think about. You can send all of your complaints to Pastor George, and I will
podcast at marshcorner.com.
And we'll continue to wrestle with this idea too. It's just something that it is a challenge for us as Christians. Not all of these things are easy, cut and dry issues. Not that we get stuff from Scripture that helps inform what we think and how we think, but there are issues that we really have to wrestle with and can disagree on. And ultimately, it's just one of those things that makes us ache for the return of the Lord and His perfect justice.
Amen.
So with that, we're glad you've joined us. We'll hope you have a great week. We'll see you back here next time. Bye now. You have been listening to Inside the Pastor Study podcast with Pastors George and Jeremy Stevens. Artwork by Caitlin Gallagher, music by Sam Demetrius, and engineering help from Ashley Gallagher. To find out more about us, head to marshcorner.com.